You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Welcome back, everyone, to episode 48 of Arsenal Pass. I'm Brendan Patrick, joined always by calling champion Hayden Dale. Hayden, how are you doing?
I'm great, Brendan. How are you?
I'm okay. Been better, but
nevertheless, we'll even out. I'm great. You're okay.
Yeah.
We're good. Good.
I'm kind of no, I'm kidding. So today we're going to be talking about ProQuests up until now. We're going to be discussing the win rates of the heroes so far, as just try and dissect the overall data that we've gotten. Thanks so much to Tower Number 9 for recording all of that. You can find it on Fab TCG, but we have a good amount of information and data to pull from here. And me and Hayden are going to try to figure out what that tells us about the classic constructed format right now. We're also going to weigh in with our overall thoughts on Everfest regarding how it has impacted the format, both from a meta perspective and a gameplay perspective. I.e., is this format actually fun? But first, Hayden, how was your week in Flesh and Blood?
Yeah, I had a good week. Played a weekend of ProQuests, so second weekend in a row of 2 ProQuests, which is the season's goal. I love the season. Like it's 4 weeks of events, right? And I think because of the quick nature of the turnaround, we're seeing a lot of shifts in the meta, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. Gives you the opportunity, I think, to try new things. So I called my shot last week on the pod. I said I was going to play a Brute. I said I was probably going to play Livia. I did play Livia on Saturday. I put together a list that was kind of an iteration on a previous list that I had for Livia, but really trying to target Prism and Star of the Show. Round 1 I played Katsu. Round 2 I played Lexi, and it didn't go too well for me. I wasn't as prepared for those matchups, the aggro matchups, and it felt very tough. That's for sure. Did not go well. So started off 0-2, decided to play one more round, paired into Prism, put the beat down on a Prism, and then dropped and left, and went and chilled out for a bit, and then got dinner with a lot of the local group because it was a double header. So the local group were kind of hanging around for the weekend. And then on Sunday, drove up north a couple of hours to another ProQuest where I decided to sleep out Prism. Viserai, rather. Did not play Prism. Viserai. Wanted to play Viserai. Played it in week 1. Wanted to play it again. It's a deck I really like to play. And ended up splitting the finals with a friend, a good friend of mine from our local. Basically runs all of our events here locally for RC Crew, who had the Australian Nationals. So Ryan got his PCI, which is awesome stuff. And just an all-around good weekend. So.
Awesome. So yeah, I also played an event. Tim Bunn, fellow Bunn brother, actually came down to Texas, and he stayed with me on Friday night, and we played an event on Saturday at Reaper Game Store. Fortunately, we both went X2, didn't make it. Kind of a reoccurring theme of my ProQuest season so far, but yeah, on my end, I think my performance or lack thereof there's been some factors that I've not been able to control that are outside of Flesh and Blood. So kind of chalking it up to some of that, but still just keeping my head in the sand, testing and focusing, on the Pro Tour, which is that's really my goal for this year, I think. So, taking a few bad beats in a row, but I'm okay with it.
Hey, that's what ProQuest season, I mean, you've got an invite or 2 invites locked away, and Indies coming up. That's a big one, and then of course the Pro Tour, not long away. I mean, what are we in mid-March almost now? So Pro Tour is less than 2 months away, or just on 2 months away, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, I'm also going to qualify off of what they call Boomer XP, so off of Lifetime XP. I think I'm going to get a qualification off of that because I'm ranked 70. So yeah, I'm definitely locked for the Pro Tour with that many PTIs, and I should be locked for every pro event in 2022, because I believe from the information that we have right now, you need 3. So I'll get on my end. Anyway, Hayden, enough of that. Let's talk about the news.
Yeah, let's do it. Want to shout out something we shouted out last week as well, was our collab with LSS. We've had some videos go up on fabtcg.com. The Everfest ProQuest Gauntlet, basically. So me and Brendan have been running in sort of some of the top decks of this ProQuest meta into one another. We've had 6 heroes, 3 matches, 2 up, and I think by the time this pod drops, actually the 3rd and final will be up, ready for the final weekend of ProQuest season, where for the last one I'm on Lexi and Brendan's on Briar, running back another Runeblade. The earlier game in the week, we played Chain versus Viscerai, which is a really interesting matchup, I think, and a lot of interesting discussion points came out of that game, which is really cool, especially around the final turn of that game. So if you haven't checked them out, you can see those on Flesh and Blood's YouTube channel. If you go to fabtcg.com, there's articles there with links to the deck list we played as well, so you can check all those out. It was a very, very fun thing to do. I'm glad we got to do it, Brendan, and I look forward to hopefully doing something like that again in the future. But in terms of gameplay, we will be back with some gameplay on our own channel following this, probably in the next couple of weeks. There's a couple of matchups I really want to play, Brendan. There's a few things we've talked about over the season because we haven't played many games. Basically, we've played more games on camera than we have off camera in the past probably 3 months, right? If not,
Yeah. Have we even played any games? I don't even think so. We had a few games before Australian Nationals, but yeah, due to my time change, right? I'm unable to kind of do morning testing anymore. Hayden and I actually haven't been playing very much. But yeah, which we see once we stopped testing, Hayden, I stopped winning, and you kept winning. I think we know who the problem is here.
Every time we play a game on camera, I seem to lose most of them. So I just maybe that's why you only want to play on camera now.
It's okay. I mean, you lose on camera for a YouTube video. I just do it in person at every pro event. So yeah, pick the lesser of the two evils.
That's true. I'll take it. All right. Well, yeah, go check those out. And as I say, me and Brendan will be back to some gameplay on our own YouTube channel, Arsenal Pass, in the future. And actually, in the lead up to Indy, got a couple of cool ideas that we're going to float onto the YouTube channel at some point. We're ready for Indianapolis around, the meta decks that are out there, and just previewing the event, really. So other than that, we also had an awesome giveaway from Legend Story Studios as well for a golden ticket, which we gave away yesterday or 2 days ago by the time this pod comes out. And our winner was Zach Roach. So congrats to Zach, who's got a golden ticket for the event. He already reached out and got his ticket all sorted. So he's going to be there, and he's going to pick up those nice goodies from LSS and Star City Games. Skirmish Season 4, Brendan, is kicking off March 26th to April 17th. We already knew about it, but at fabtcg.com did publish, official sort of timelines, and you can go check out the store locator. I think all events are now in there, so you can go and see what's local to you for the Skirmish season. It's all Blitz, which is interesting. In the past we've had, I think 1 and 2 were split, right? And then season 3 was Blitz, and now Blitz again. So I wonder if we'll see the return of Limited into Skirmish season.
Yeah, I can't remember if number 1 was Blitz only.
No, it wasn't.
As well.
It was sealed. I played the sealed one.
Yeah. So, and I remember that it was actually, I think that like the stores that were more established got the limited ones, while maybe newer stores or stores that had less of a relationship with LSS actually got the Blitz one. So it's interesting to see us move to fully Blitz. I'm assuming that's because we had a set come out that was a supplemental set. So the limited format isn't necessarily fresh per se. But yeah, I'm kind of bummed. I'll kind of get out of my house for limited. It's harder to get me to travel to these
Blitz?
events for Blitz. Yeah,
I stand corrected actually. So last season, was a split format because we had draft as well, which I loved. That draft skirmish was awesome. But season 2 was Blitz only, and season 1 was sealed and Blitz. So yeah, I don't know. I'd love to see that limited format come back again for skirmish, but probably once we get to the next set, because of course we've already done a skirmish season with Tales of Aria draft. But I'd love to see the next draft format be included in skirmish as well. I think it's a really cool thing to see. So we shall see what happens there. Moving on as well, there's a really great article up on FabTCG that just went live 2 days ago from friend of the show, someone we've had on Time the Round before, and Indianapolis caster Brian Gottlieb. I'm really excited to see that Brian is going to be around Flesh and Blood coverage. I've seen him through Magic coverage. If you are a Magic player, you might have seen the same through the SCG tour. Brian is a mainstay from there and did a lot of coverage for Magic over the years, a lot of writing as well, and is now dipping his toe into Flesh and Blood. I mean, to be honest, Brian actually he joined us in Time around mid last year, so Brian's been playing Flesh and Blood for a while now, and finally making the move over to doing some coverage and writing some articles. So yeah, go check that out. 5 reasons you should be at Indianapolis if you can make it. Brendan, you'll be there.
Yeah, actually,
that's reason number 6. That's a super secret reason number 6 is Brendan will be there.
I will be there. Hopefully I don't take another L on camera. Surely I'm gonna break my streak. Yeah. Just want to also shout out all of the patrons, of course, of Arsenal Pass. The support is amazing, and it really helps Hayden and I do what we do. And it's incredible to think too. I mean, I think I mentioned this the past, 3 pods, but we are getting close to that 52nd episode, Hayden. So almost 1 year of doing this, and I think looking at that number, it's incredible to look back at our growth thus far. But yeah, if you're interested in the Arsenal Pass Patreon, there is tons of extra content on there, including extra podcasts, deck techs, deck guides, and some other spicy stuff. It also gives you access to the Discord, where you can talk to Hayden and tell him what you think of his decks and ask him for deck lists whenever, right, Hayden?
Hey, I'm always on there. Come drop by for a chat. If we at Brendan enough times, he pops in as well. So thank you to everyone. And we also, through this ProQuest season, both Brendan and myself have been putting up our deck lists and our sideboard sort of plans and loose guides that we've had for each of the events that we've gone to. So for Viserai, I've done mine. Prism, we both did ours. I did an updated Rhinar guide as well. So awesome stuff, and a big thank you to everyone, as you say. And like you say, 52 episodes coming out, Brendan. I think we're gonna have to do something to celebrate. I think we're gonna have to stump up on our side for a bit of a giveaway. I think we've maybe got a few locked away.
Your gold foil that you haven't opened yet. You're opening it on this podcast. I forgot to ask you. Now that you've reminded me, via a giveaway.
We'll see. We'll see when we get to episode 52 how we feel. But I think we've got a few playmats locked away in the cupboard for a special time like this. So maybe we'll do a few giveaways and things for episode 52. It is fast approaching. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Hayden, it is that time of the day. A little famished myself, but I know I got my friend from down under over here, and he can put a mean shrimp on the Barbie. So why don't you start us off in this community cookout section?
Do you know, when I moved to Australia, really disappointed. I've never, ever heard someone say, put another shrimp on the Barbie. Literally ever.
I've never heard it myself either over here.
Doesn't
kind of just came up with it on the fly.
Yeah, Crocodile Dundee, mate. All right, Commander Cookout, we got a question from the King of None through the Arsenal Pass Discord. Thank you for the question, King of None. I like this question. I think it's a great question. And Brendan, I'm sure you'll have a few thoughts about this, just as we're in the middle of the ProQuest season. I think we've actually even had this discussion a little bit between us. Question is, when making decisions regarding deck choice for events, how much does deck complexity come into account? I'm struggling with the concept that I believe Viserai is the best deck, but that nearly every loss, with a few Starver-related exceptions, I've taken this ProQuest season is due to my own mistakes. On the other hand, a deck like Bravo Star of the Show is inherently much less complicated, and a lot of players I really respect are sticking with him because of that raw power and simplicity, though there is the downside of having less agency over the course of the game. So, back to the question. When making decisions regarding deck choice for events, how much does deck complexity come into account for you, Brendan?
So, I remember we had this conversation a lot back in the days of Chain, and I think if people are going to, a lot of people's the first idea that will come to mind when I say that is going to be, oh, you're just like YOLOing people with Chain. And no, it was actually this game plan we had into Fatigue. It was very mentally taxing and actually quite challenging to pull off, and didn't have a lot of room for error. So I remember back in those days was really when I thought about this question a lot, because inevitably we would have to play a lot of those matches, and it was mentally fatiguing. And I think it's something to consider. I know on my end, it ended up being not nearly as impactful as I thought, especially at a pro event. Maybe because I came in with so much practice that I felt very comfortable, whether it was into a matchup that required more mental sort of bandwidth versus another that maybe didn't. So for me, it hasn't played much of a factor, but I think that's more of a practice thing. The thing that I do consider that is sort of an outside variable is how long it will take me to make a decision for my turn. So that Chain deck would inevitably come down to like the final turn of the game or the final 2 turns of the game that were infinitely more complex than every other turn that you had done prior to that. And playing at a pro event, specifically playing on coverage, you're not allotted a lot of time to think about those turns, regardless of how much you've taken on previous to that, which is standard. I'm not saying that's a bad system, but I do actively try to avoid decks where I know I'm going to get to this sort of crux, and I might need to think about an incredibly complex line. If I don't think I can do that quickly enough, I might actually not pick that deck for that exact reason. Also, of course, timing out and stuff like that, but that's a whole nother conversation. Hayden, what about you in terms of simplicity versus decks that are going to require more mental energy over a long tournament?
So I go back to this concept of like linear versus non-linear game plans, right? And we've talked about it a lot. We did a full podcast on it on the Arsenal Pass Patreon, but I think it's tied really closely to that, this idea of deck complexity. Like King of None talks about, Star of the Show versus Viscerai, and Viscerai has a lot of, basically Viscerai doesn't have one set game plan. You might have these two kind of macro game plans that are like an OTK or a kind of more tempo based, mid-range aggro deck. But then within each of even those plans, you've got subsets of plans. So the OTK isn't necessarily always just a one-turn kill. You're not just kind of mindlessly throwing out rune chants until you kill them. Often you don't kill your opponent on that turn, and then you go into the second phase of the game where the game plan shifts to this kind of like grind fest to deal the last few points of damage. Or on the flip side, you're playing this aggressive deck, but actually at some point in the game, maybe I need to take a step back and set up a turn and get this big Skalata turn happening. So there's a lot of like decision points in that, and that is really taxing. It's one of the things that almost put me off playing Viscerai for Nationals. It's what put me off playing Viscerai for the Orlando calling, to be honest, and a big part was just not enough preparation and not feeling comfortable in those lines. But I think to your point, like those decks and those kind of styles, like you just talked about the chain, if I can get enough reps with that, then often going into the event, it isn't actually as mentally taxing. There's a lot of things where play lines have come up before. There's more intuitive decisions that I can make on certain turns. And often it may feel like, he talks about, King of None talks about Viscerai being, in their eyes, one of the most powerful decks in the format. And I agree with that. But in terms of your decisions on a turn-to-turn basis, sometimes you might make the wrong decision. But I honestly think the percentage points you lose are not that massive, but you can lose enough over the course of the game with your decisions that it makes the deck, a lot harder to, I guess, get the wins with. You're really taking away your percentages from wins by doing that. So unless you know the lines inside and out, I think it can be really difficult to get to close to, I guess, a maximum of where you want to be. This kind of principle of like some of these linear decks you can play at 80, 90% with not relative ease, but with reps and with understanding and with good play. Whereas without the reps, it's really hard to play some of these less linear decks without the reps, and it's really hard to play them. Maybe you're sitting around like a 60, 70% proficiency, and that's going to lose you a lot of games, right? So it definitely factors into it for me, but it's probably more about if I'm going to play these, then I really want to understand them inside and out. And sometimes I will fall back on decks that maybe have less of this kind of, they're a bit easier to play, so to speak. I don't even see that. I just see them as maybe a bit more linear, to be honest. I don't necessarily think they're easier to play, but I think the inherent power is more raw and is a bit easier to extract from. But yeah, in saying that, like I honestly think it just depends. Like I never want to play a deck unprepared anyway. Like I wouldn't even pick up Star of the Show, say this weekend, and just like run it in cold. I just don't think that would. I'm never going to get to enough proficiency or feel good enough, because I think there is, to win mirrors, to win certain matchups, there's certain things that I need to understand, and without that, maybe it is the last 10%, but I don't have that. So that really does factor into me. I think it's honestly a big piece of it, but there's more to it than just is it easy to play or is it not easy to play. It's all about the experience and the time spent with it as well.
What I think is kind of funny is that this concept of agency is actually a two-way street. It's like some decks give you a lot more agency to outplay your opponent and play optimally to an extent that gives you a higher win rate, but they will also give you the inverse of that, which is you have more opportunity to play yourself into a loss and to play unoptimally as well. And you have to kind of look at the, what is that going to look like over the course of 9, 12 rounds potentially? Is the delta of that just going to be a negative EV for you overall? But yeah, I just think it's kind of a funny concept, this idea of agency. I tend to go for decks like that myself, but yeah, I hope we answered that question. I think that there's a lot of layers to it, like what you spoke to, Hayden, but also there's all these other kind of third party factors you have to think about, where it's like, does my deck finish the game in time? Can I make all of my decisions ever, like in every turn, in under 30 seconds or whatever it is? Like, there's a lot that goes into selecting a deck for a tournament outside of just its raw power level.
I think you can make a bit of a like a mental checklist almost. So King of None's talking about, the complexity of a deck. I think that's a big part of it. Like maybe you want to assign that as like, that's half of the reason I might play any given deck. Then there's other things that are probably going to make up the rest of it, right? Like you talked about how well can I like operate in Swiss? What are my matchups given the meta, I think? What's my proficiency with this? Like you can go through all those things, right? And then come to like a checklist of like, okay, yeah, this deck is maybe inherently more powerful, but with my understanding of it, with my reps of the current meta, it's it falls below where this other deck is currently sitting for me. So I have some experience with this deck, so I'm going to pick it up and play it. That's kind of, to be honest, kind of what I did with Prism in week 2. is I didn't have a lot of experience at Prism, but I identified that for me, I think that was the best meta call for that weekend. And I had enough sort of reps and got to play some games through the week that I felt it was, even though I had a lot of experience on the Viscerai deck I played the week before, I felt like it was the right decision for the week. And, worked out. And I think that's a big way about choosing decks, to be honest. It's all part of the parcel.
100%. Well, Hayden, like I said, we got a lot of data to go through this week. I think we have some very good insight on the current meta of Everfest and Classic Constructed. So let's go ahead and head into the main topic of the pod here.
Yeah, definitely. So we're very fortunate that over this ProQuest season, we've had a lot of different people collecting data. So we've had, Legend Story studios themselves requesting data from the stores running these events. So meta breakdowns, the top 8 breakdowns, and deck lists for these winners, which they're then using along with Davis Kingsley with Tower Number 9 to produce these weekly articles, which is basically a metagame breakdown for the ProQuest. We've also had community-based, players also producing their own data. So gathering data from stores, understanding which, even like total base of like win rates. And we're going to talk about one of those community content creators who has done that as well. But even early in week 1, we had someone running a sheet for all the data they could gather in terms of like top 8s and conversions and things like that. So there's a lot of data out there. And I would even say there's maybe more than last road, like the Road to Nationals. But last time we had Tower Number 9, we had Davis Kingsley, a really prominent figure, putting that into a really clean spreadsheet and being like, here's the data. Whereas now we have to wait, 3 or 4 days post the weekend for Davis to put up that article. But we have that data. So what I want to do, Brendan, is actually just go to start with. Like, let's look at this data. Let's have a discussion about this data. Let's go to week 1. Let's go to week 2. And then let's go to a little bit of other data we have and just look at how the meta's evolved and what we're seeing happening in terms of meta share, top 8s, and win percentage. So should we get into it?
Yeah, let's get into it.
So week 1, if we look at week 1, percentage of overall players in week 1, the metagame was 22% Bravo Star of the Show. And then you had next biggest being Prism at 13%, and then 14% Viscerai, then Prism 13% Viscerai. So those are the kind of the 3 decks for week 1, which I think came as no surprise, right? That's like what we talked about. That's what we've said in the last 2 podcasts, and it's what we expected to happen. And then if you look at the placings, so, what was top 8 in those weeks? Well, 36% of the top 8 was Bravo, so a really big conversion rate. Prism was down on its play rate to conversion rate at 12%, and Viscerai was up, 14.5% to 15, almost 16% in terms of top 8 placings. And then you look at wins, and then so in week 1, 47% of Bravo Star wins with Bravo Star of the Show. Prism was around 15% by the looks of it, and then Viscerai struggling to convert on the wins at about just under 10%. So some really interesting points on the big 3 decks there. What are your kind of takeaways when you look at that from week 1?
My favorite takeaway from the season is that Viscerai is the what Prism was in Road to National season.
A lot of top 8s.
Viscerai. Yeah, well, not even a lot of top 8s. We just see a decent amount of representation, and then like it converts in week 1, but the conversion to top 8 actually gets pretty bad in week 2. And the overall conversion from top 8 to win with Viscerai is actually pretty terrible. And it's like consistently happening, which is pretty funny. We actually see the opposite with Prism. So Prism is converting quite well into top 8s. We see here in week 1 coming from Swiss and getting into top 8, so getting past the Swiss region. It wasn't amazing for Prism from a statistical standpoint, but then ultimately getting the win in that top 8, it did make quite a leap and looks like it performed very well. And I'm assuming that we can kind of attribute that to the amount of Starvos that were in those top 8s, right? Because we have almost 50% of events won by Starvo here.
Yeah, one of my favorite stats though, and we get this from Davis's article, is the top 8 conversion. So representation in the meta, and then that converting into top 8, I think is one of the coolest sort of stats we have here. And I don't know if you're looking at this, Brendan, but otherwise, take a guess which. So Star of the Show had the number 1 top 8 conversion at 36 or nearly 37%. What hero do you think had the second highest conversion into top 8 in week 1?
I'm not looking, so I have to guess. Is it like a fringe deck? Is it one that is not played very much?
It's not that fringe.
Is it Oldham?
No, it's not.
What is it?
It's Chain. And nearly a 34% conversion from Swiss to top 8. And I think that's where a big part of the discussion on Chain in week 1 came from, right? Like, there's kind of the sentiment going into week 2 that Chain could be a very good pick, plays really well into Prism, which I agree with, but also maybe plays well into Star of the Show, which, I think that might be... I'm not 100% sure on that myself. I think that matchup is tough, but really surprising. I mean, there's a big drop-off after that to the third highest deck in terms of that top 8 conversion, which ends up being, Ultim. Like you did call it. That's the third place at 27%, which I think had a good week 1, just played really well into Starvo in week 1, and there was less Prism hanging around in week 1, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Chain question week 1 is an interesting one, because I do agree, especially in the context of what the Prism decks look like right now, and where they really cannot side into Fatigue Plan as efficiently as they used to be able to. And I do genuinely believe that Chain is more fatigable, if that's a word, than he was back in Monarch or Tales of Aria. But these decks are packed with so many auras and so many 2-blocks that Chain is getting past these Prism decks. Looks like with a decent amount of ease. But I also agree with you, having tested Chain into Starvo, that while it is winnable, it is quite hard. Like, the Husk is quite an asset against Bravo Star of the Show, but Disruption just does not feel great. Getting cards ripped out of your hand, and I think it can be quite rough on the Chain side.
There's a reason that I wanted to talk through week 1, and people, you might be thinking, oh, why are we talking about week 1? We're in week 3 now, heading into week 4. I think it's really important that we understand kind of the shifts that we're about to see, and we're about to talk about week 2 as well. But one of the last things I want to look at actually here is, so win conversion. So, Star of the Show has kind of dominated the statistics in week 1, has 7% win conversion. So if 7% of the players who entered with Star of the Show into a ProQuest won a ProQuest, right? Ultim is the second highest at 5.5%, and then Prism at nearly 5%. So Prism had a really good week 1 in terms of its showing, in terms of it was the third highest played deck, but in terms of win conversion. And I guess actually, so win percentage, it was 18.9%. So it had the second highest win percentage in the meta behind Star of the Show. Viserai was definitely struggled in terms of win percentage, like you said before, it was below 10%. And then top 8 to win, which is really interesting. So of the top 8s, how are people converting? Because you talked about before, like who's converting on those top 8s. Well, Star of the Show again dominates that with nearly 20%. But actually, top 8 to wins. Star of the Show isn't the highest. Sorry, I did say dominate. It did well, 18%. But Prism, 23.5% almost in terms of top 8 to win. So those Prisms make it into, they were really converting, as was OG Bravo. But very small count on that data for that one.
Reasonably small. Larger than I expect with this kind of conversion number. Yeah, 2 wins. Yeah, so I mean, the data's really interesting, and I think that getting a picture for what week 1 looks like heading into week 2, it tells a really important story about the Flesh and Blood meta and how it works and how it adapts. And I think we've learned a lot, specifically on like how much sometimes like influencers or big events can influence a meta. Like Bravo Star of the Show's performance in week 1 and representation is largely due to the SCG tournament that happened before then, where we saw that deck dominate. I actually didn't think that it would, as many people would pick it up quite as quickly, because it wasn't, it was a new class, it was a new hero, so not only did it require testing, but it required people to own those cards. So I really was surprised with the amount of people that were playing that deck week 1, and going past that, it's the deck. Bravo Star of the Show has been resilient. I expect it to be hated out of the meta quite quickly, and we're looking to head into Indianapolis here, where I think that it's still the deck to beat.
Yeah, still going to be the most played deck, I think, is very true. But one thing I want to talk about is like, what does the data tell you? Like, what's the story? Well, Prism had a really good showing in week 1. So, and if you take a step back and go, what happens in week 2 based on the data? Well, if you think Prism has a good matchup into Star of the Show, it feels like Prism is set to dominate week 2 at this point, right? Star of the Show we know is the most popular deck by far and large. Also, in terms of just other raw statistics, it's won the most events, has the most top 8s. It's very likely going to be poised to be heavily played and to win a lot of events again in week 2. And then you might say, well, actually, is Viserai the right choice? Viserai, just based on the data, is not performing that well. Maybe there's a few other options sitting outside there that could be, could be worth looking at, especially in terms of top 8 conversion. Chain, Briar, both did really well in week 1. So let's move on. Let's talk about week 2 of that data, Brennan, and take a look at kind of how we shift. So in terms of the percentages of overall players in week 2, we saw a change. So we saw Bravo's slight uptick, start of the show, from 22.1% to 22.5%, so very slight in terms of meta share. Viscerai says around about the same as well, 14.4 to 14.8. Prism from 13% up to 15.2%. So like we said, probably see more Prism this week. And then in terms of some of the other decks that are sitting out there that are kind of the next lot sitting around there, the week prior, we saw that Chain was 7%. That actually drops off to 6.4%, so maybe not quite what you expect. And Lexi goes from 7% to 8%, so a rise in Lexi as well. So is that kind of what you would expect to see heading into week 2?
Honestly, the Lexi I didn't expect.
The rise. It's only a slight rise, but it's a rise.
And I think it's kind of at the front of my mind because in my local meta, Lexi is actually extremely popular. Like, I was so surprised. I think that what probably was the second or third most popular deck, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the jump from the 5th most popular deck to the second or third it's a huge jump. There were so many Lexis here in Dallas. All different variations as well. Ice Lexi, Lightning Lexi, like sort of no fuse Lexi. So I think that, finally Ranger players can't complain anymore. They do have what could be, a tier 1.5 or tier 1 deck on their hands. So, it's their time.
So then we look at the percentage of top 8 placings. So Bravo drops off a bit here, is 33% of the top 8s from 36. So, a slight drop off, but it is a drop off to about a third of top 8s is now star of the show. Prism doubles almost, going from 11.7% to nearly 21% of the top 8 placings. So, if you looked at the data last week, you'd say, yeah, this is starting to make some sense. We're starting to see a story here of how this meta is evolving. We're starting to see the balance to star of the show maybe start to come out. And Viscerai, goes from, pretty tough sort of week 1, 15.8% to 16.3%. So a bit of a rise. And Chain also drops off actually from 10.4% to 8.4%. And that's kind of it. Lexi drops off a little bit. And then all the fringe decks kind of about the same. There's 1 or 2 here, 1 or 2 there as we head into week 2. And then Brennan, we look at the percentage of wins, the one that kind of starts to tell us a bit of a story. Yeah. So we went from nearly 50% of wins in week 1 being Bravo star of the show, 47.1%. And we do see a drop off to 43.2%. So still winning a lot. Prism went from winning about 19% to 27% of the events. Viscerai up to 10%, a little bit of a bump there. And Chain and all the rest, sort of Lexi, those guys, they all sit around the same. Lexi actually drops, Old Time actually drops off a lot from week 1, where it won a couple of events, to just being a 1 winner. So bit of a change there, but really the story in week 2 is like Prism. It's Prism eating into star of the show. It's not really, we're not seeing much of a story from Viscerai. It's kind of the same. Chain's kind of the same. Lexi's kind of the same.
Yeah, I mean, Prism stock definitely rising after the performance of Starvo in week 1. And I think the Starvo pick was sticky, right? Like, people stayed on the deck after it performed correctly, even though it looked like there was a deck that obviously targeted it and looked like the deck to kind of be on for that week 2. I think, we saw a lot of loyalty to that class heading into the week after that. And I think as a result, Prism was able to overperform in terms of wins.
There's a really important factor as well to play in this, like in terms of overall players. There is a barrier, like there is a switching cost in Flesh and Blood. If you go out and you build a deck, then how hard is it to go and build another deck? I mean, it's not, financially it's not cheap. If you're in search of legendaries, especially if maybe you want to change to Star of the Show and you need 2 legendary shields, a legendary chest, a legendary helm, and Majestics to fill out the deck. Like that's not an easy. There's definitely a barrier to change and switching costs. So I think that's something really important to think about. We're not going to see immediate changes of meta overnight from week to week in terms of 15, 20%, but 5-6%, that is a big change in terms of both win percentage and representation. Because when you think about players are going to play the decks they know, players have only, we've only got certain decks that we can play. That is a real thing to consider. So when you start to factor those things in, 4, 5, 6%, that is a significant change. It's not small at all.
No, definitely not. And I mean, there's more to that switch as well, right? We obviously have the financial barrier, but also time investment. I mean, you have you
1
could
week.
potentially have 1 week to learn an entirely new class, which is honestly, that's not the hard part. The hard part is kind of being prepared for all of the matchups. I mean, that takes a lot of time, especially when we have to start thinking about some of the fringe stuff. Like when you have to include like Ice Lexi, like your game plan to this tax deck, which can look very different than pretty much your game plan to like everything else. So yeah, finding the time to develop, correct sideboard plans, build the deck, and be prepared. A week is it's pretty short.
Yep. So, I want to talk about some of these stats because things start to tighten up when we look at top 8 conversion this week. So, start of the show, still very good top 8 conversion. So, 40%. I mean, is that bigger than last week? That ends up being, so it's a higher top 8 conversion. So, that's a significant thing that's happening. Although Prism ends up in win shares, the top 8 conversion actually start of the show, less players this week, but more players getting into top 8 or a higher percentage getting into top 8. This array picks it up a bit in top 8 conversion, 29%, 35.5%, or 36% basically for Prism. So, a strong showing there. And also Chain's kind of the other one as well with a 34% conversion. Any kind of disappointing ones? Well, Bolton 17.5%. It's, somewhat surprising. Briar drops back to 20%. And then, things like Elixir, 14.5% really struggle. So, although showing out, same with Altum, 14.5% struggling to break into that top 8. Then you look at win conversion, which I think is always very interesting. So, ends up being, star of the show is there. 6.5% is the top dog in terms of win percentage again. Win conversion. But Prism, now 6%. So, just behind star of the show in terms of how it's converting into wins. And Viserai at 3.8%. So those are the three. And we see Chain back at 2.6%, kind of behind there. And then top 8 to win. All right, so if you make it a top 8, who's winning? Katsu. Katsu with the highest, getting his top 8, converting on wins, 18% of conversion in terms of top 8 to win. But then, again, a bit of a small sample size there. Star of the show, 16.7, and then Prism just behind at 16.5. So we're really seeing it start to tighten up and change. And then Bolton at 14 and Viserai at 13.
Yeah. So Hayden, when you look at we talked about a lot of numbers there, but let's bring this out to sort of the aggregate, break it down, right? What does this tell you? Like what I see is we have 3 dominant decks, and I think that we're as close as we've ever been to a rock paper scissors format in Flesh and Blood. Like we have this sort of, and this is obviously not how it goes every time. Starvo beats Viserai, Prism beats Starvo, Viserai beats Prism, right? And that's what we see kind of play out. And there's all this little kind of these other decks that kind of try to navigate in between that as well. Chain being the one that's most significantly represented. Like it's an interesting format. This has been the hardest one to sort of navigate, I think, as a player, because like these representations, like we can look at the data and like you have some clear takeaways, but sometimes like your local meta can make what looks to be the right pick just the absolutely wrong pick. So for instance, on my end, like I remember showing up to week 1 or I think it was week 2. Yeah, it was week 2 because I wasn't able to play week 1. And I think I saw 1 Starvo in the entire event. Everybody else was on Prism, which is just not indicative of this data at all. So just definitely a local format kind of thing. And if I had, I brought Prism to try and prey on the Starvos, and I ended up playing against, a ton of Chains and other Prisms. But Hayden, for you, how are you looking at kind of taking this data and attacking it, right? Like how do you decide what deck to pick? You haven't played Starvo yet, right? You played a lot of decks. Gotten the win on Viserai, the win on Prism, and we can call it almost a win on
I won a game on Livia, so
won a game on Levia. So but you haven't played Starvo yet, right? So out of the big 3, there's one that you haven't put much time into. Why is that? And just tell me a little bit about how you're breaking down this data and preparing for these matches week by week.
Yeah, so I'm going to come back to the question on Starvo. Remind me. I want to talk a little bit about the data first and how to break that down. The first thing I want to point out, because you just made a good point about local metas, if you look at week 2, overall percentage of players, and you add up those big 3 that we just talked about, the Prism, the Viserai, and the star of the show, what you're actually looking at is just over half of the field. There's another half of the field. It's not just those 3 decks. So you do have to factor the fact that even if you believe based on win percentage, if you actually look at it, then you're 50% of the players are those three. But then as you get through maybe into rounds 4, 5, 6, top 8, then it's a high percentage of those three for sure. But at some point, you're going to have to play these other decks, whether it be in like round 1 to 3, maybe more likely. But even still in the later rounds, we saw Bolton and Katsu both have really good performances this week as well. Chain and Briar are still around there. There's still another half to this meta. So when I look at the starter, that's actually the biggest thing I take away, honestly, is that, and I learned that lesson the hard way on Saturday when I played Livia, is that my first 2 rounds, I didn't play into one of the 2 top decks that I was really tuned to face, and I suffered for it hard because I just wasn't prepared for it. I didn't have I had game plans, but they weren't good enough to beat those decks. And that's actually what I think you need to take from the starter, is that we're not seeing 70% representation by the big 3 decks. We're seeing 50 to 55% representation by these big 3 decks. And yes, they're winning a lot, but they're the best 3 decks in the format is probably what you'd say right now. So yeah, in terms of that, what am I seeing other than that? Well, I'm seeing the story we talked about, the shifting story. Prism has started to, really start to come in and combat Bravo Star of the Show. Viserai is still there and winning games and winning events, but maybe the percentage talks to just how complicated that deck is. Maybe there's a bit of story behind that data. And then I'm looking at some of these decks that are sitting in and around there, these heroes that are sitting in and around their Chains, Briars. They are putting up results, and they're in the meta, and they're seeing top 8s, maybe less so in win shares, but what are they doing? What are they trying to actively prey on? And then that kind of takes me to, I guess, where I say, all right, based on the 2 weeks of data and then what I've seen this week and week 3 as well, we will get the data for that shortly. What does that mean? Well, I want to be able to make sure that I can combat the top 3. And then I want to make sure that I have game into some of these other decks. It doesn't need to be all of them. Maybe I pop in, I pair into Lexi, and that's a bad matchup for me, is what it is. Or I pair into Chain, that's a bad matchup for me. But that's kind of the decision to play Prism in week 2 for me was, I knew Chain was a bad matchup. I knew Briar was not a great matchup, but I felt confident in, playing against the other 2, sort of the big 3 of the big 2. The big 2 of the big 3, and plus some of the more fringe decks as well, just because of the raw power of it. So basically, if I'm getting into this last week of ProQuest based on this data, I want a deck that has raw power that I can play into a wide format, because we are in a wide meta. The data tells you that. And also something that's going to be able to play favorably at least into 2 of the big 3, and maybe I can flip/win some of my games against the 3rd of the big 3.
So maybe for the first time ever in history, my goldfish brain has not forgotten. Why have you not played Starvo?
So I think that Starvo is reasonable. Bravo Star of the Show is reasonable. I don't love a lot of the deck lists right now because I think I actually think they're pretty targetable. I actually think your matchup into Prism is really bad, as most of these Elemental Star of the Show lists, and I don't want to play. I actually think it's one of the worst matchups of the big 3. So I think Viserai, for instance, can sort of play into Star of the Show and can win pretty consistently, but I don't think it's necessarily favored. I think into Prism, you're like favored, but not heavily favored. And then for Prism, likewise, I think you have a really good matchup in Star of the Show, and you have, you can win into Viserai. It's not completely terrible for you. But I honestly feel playing Star of the Show, and it's not that I haven't touched this deck and played with it. I've played quite a few games with the Star of the Show, different versions, elemental versions. I've played some more slower control versions as well. I think trying to beat Prism is just such a tough ask, especially against a competent and a skilled Prism player. So honestly, that's the reason. I just don't want to take you talked about before about having lines and being able to have a deck that's good into the field. I personally don't feel that Star of the Show is that deck. Yes, you can, you have these nuts hands, right? Maybe you get a pulse early and you get to hold it and you get to come in. But into Prism, as long as they draw auras and they're able to soak up some of that pressure, it's still really hard to win. And if I'm winning 30% of games against Prism, I don't really think that's where I want to be on a deck in this meta right now.
Do you think that you may also not be very enthusiastic about playing the Bravo Star of the Show mirror as well?
No, I actually think that's one of the more enjoyable matchups. I don't know. I actually don't, of the mirrors I've played so far. I haven't hated it, to be honest. I've liked those matchups. I honestly I don't hate. I think I've said it before. We had a bit of a discussion about this. I don't hate the design of the hero. I think it has a really cool thing. I think you have to offset being able to activate that ability by having some cards that are weaker in isolation in the deck, but are really powerful in that kind of shell that you play out. But yeah, honestly, it is that big thing of having a deck that I think is a big sort of underdog or a big dog to one of the best decks in the format. And I think maybe, spoiler for what we get to, but I think maybe the best deck to play right now, the best deck in the format in Prism.
Yeah. I think that yeah, it's funny. I felt pretty confident that Viserai was going to be the best deck this format, but just with Starvo sticking around, regardless of Prism's representation and sort of success, I less and less want to be playing Viserai. I do quite enjoy the Viserai matchup into Prism. I don't find it very enjoyable into Bravo. Speaking, kind of going back to the Command and Cookout section, I don't feel like I have a lot of agency in that matchup. And then I also hate the Viserai mirror. That mirror sucks. That mirror is genuinely terrible, and is quite quite a bit of variance around who draws Mordred Tides per se. But yeah, I mean for me I'm also looking at the same thing. I mean Prism is the deck that I want to be on. I also have the most fun playing Prism. Like Prism getting these new tools and like kind of flushing out this Aura Prism archetype. It's actually fun. It's quite complex and I genuinely enjoy the deck.
I'm guessing your reason for playing Star of the Show might be different to mine then? For not playing Star of the Show, sorry.
For not playing Star of the Show, so I've also played quite a bit of Star of the Show in testing. But yeah, I don't like playing decks where I think I'm genuinely unfavored into one of the most popular decks in the format. Like I feel like the Prism matchup is quite bad, right? And I know I was talking to my friend Rob Seigel from Tolarian Dropouts. He actually, he had said that he was on a Bravo list this weekend that was quite, was a bit better into Prism, and then he was able to actually take down a win. But prior to that, like the list that I've been playing, they were genuinely they were quite terrible unless you high rolled into Prism. So it's just not. It's honestly, it's never what I strive for. I've never played one of those decks yet in Flesh and Blood. I might in the situation of something like a Pro Tour, but for events like this, yeah, I'm not going to be playing a deck like that I feel like can be targeted and just has what I feel like is a very bad matchup into the second most popular deck.
Mm-hmm. I want to stay away from numbers from the rest of this because I've said a lot of numbers in this, but I think it was important to get a handle on where we've gone and where the story is, and that the numbers are Star of the Show, the numbers are Prism coming through, the numbers are that Viserai is okay but not standout, and that there is decks that are coming and performing. Chain had a phenomenal week 1, had a pretty strong week 2. There is things coming out there, but I guess the question I want to ask you, Brendan, is what's behind the data? Like we've inferred a few things, but what are the things that the data is actually not telling you? Do you think so? One for me is that I think Viserai's performance is really contingent on the fact that I think that deck is really hard to play. I think you have a lot of like close matchups and you'll lose a lot of 50-50s just from maybe some misplays or incorrect sequencings of lines and things like that. And I think that is detrimental to, it's something that we're not seeing portrayed in the data, is that Viserai is a very difficult deck to play. Do you have any other sort of insights maybe that are things behind the data and when it comes to just what we've seen from this format so far?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, from the data, it looks like Prism is good into Starvo, but not good enough, right? Not good enough to actually hate him out of the format. And I thought that the power level was near that, right? Like, I think if we were at a more curated event, like you would see Starvos really struggle into people, picking Prism to try and target that deck. But the Starvo deck is like the players that have been on it. It's been very sticky. Like I said, they've stuck to it. It's performed consistently well, and it's hanging around, which I really didn't expect. And I think the data shows that that's going to keep happening until some sort of. I think until the next big event, like maybe Indianapolis could change that. But I think for now, for the rest of ProQuest, Bravo Star of the Show will be the number one deck. It'll be the top represented deck. It'll be the top converting deck. But I think if in Indianapolis we get to a top 8 where there's almost no Starvo, or Starvo really struggles because people, are targeting that event or targeting that deck in a sort of a pro level situation or tournament, then we could see people swap off of it. But for now, I think that he's the top dog right now. There's only more to come.
Yeah, I think one thing that we're going to see continue this pattern in Flesh and Blood is that the most powerful linear deck in the format be heavily represented, heavily played, and do well. And I honestly don't think that's going to change. I think I've said this before. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. And Star of the Show, I think, is that for this current meta. Do I think another more powerful linear strategy could take over? Maybe, but it would have. The thing with these linear strategies is they often kind of come to the surface pretty early. We had Lightning Brian in the last format, which was like one of the, I guess, the format's worst kept secret heading into into that Orlando weekend. You had Dash in a prior format. You had Chain, of course, which maybe had a little bit more nuance to it, but at its core root of how people were playing it was a very linear, aggressive deck. So I don't see that changing. But what I do see is that, and part of that, I guess, behind the data is I think it has one of the best matchup spreads, right? Like its raw power is going to do well into whatever, I don't know, Joe brings to Armory this week, and then into the ProQuest. Like I think that is gonna happen. So Prism, on the other hand, targets the best deck a bit more. And has a very favorable matchup to it in my eyes, but maybe its matchup spread isn't as good, and has trouble in some of these aggressive decks, and those are going to be there because as we talked about, just under 50% of the meta is other things that aren't the big three, and we're going to continue to see those, and that isn't really going to change. I don't think. We're heading into week 4 this week. I don't think the big three are going to make up more than they did in week 1 or week 2.
I do like my biggest takeaway, and I've been sort of formulating this thesis through the past few formats, and I think it's really important. So outside of very big events like national championships, and even in that case, the meta is always simpler than you think to predict. Like I spent way too much time trying to overcomplicate it, target the deck that targets the deck, have good matchups across the board, and prepare for other people to try to, heavily innovate on a mass scale, right? Like really, really, swap over to, like in this case, what would be Prism, because it does seem like it's clear, right? I've consistently been wrong almost every single time. It's always much simpler than that. There's a big event, there's a deck that looks dominant, and it wins. If it's a linear deck and it's easy to play, that deck will be massively represented and almost everybody will be on it. It's happened every single time. Like even back in Road to Nationals, I remember how just ridiculous the data was to say don't play Prism. Like the numbers said that was just a horrible deck to be on, but people kept sticking to it because Prism had some some success before, and then ultimately saw win in Vegas. I'm not saying these things can't change, in the end, but okay, so we have Matt Fox win with Lightning Briar on stream, and then boom, it's so predictable. Hayden, you were in Orlando with me, Nationals heavily Lightning Briar, Orlando the day after heavily Lightning Briar. Now in this case, we had SEG with Starvo, many Starvos in the top 8, and then there it is again. I think it's just if you're trying to target the meta for these things like ProQuests, Road to Nationals, even callings, it's just a lot simpler. Just keep it simple, right? It's pretty consistent what people will be on, what they'll be playing, and I think you just really need to have a good matchup into that. And if you can round out your the rest of your matchups into whatever else you can run into, maybe the fringe decks as well, then you're in a good spot. So moving forward, I'm not going to overcomplicate it because it's hurt me throughout this past year.
I think it's a good call. I talked about last week, I said Prism, I think very strong deck. Is it the deck I would play this weekend? Maybe not, but maybe that's, like you say, overcomplicating things, because Prism is good into the top deck in the format and has just a pretty strong game plan. Has a very good plan A and has a pretty reasonable spread. I talked about, like Chain and Briar. One of the reasons I wouldn't play Chain right now is I think that, maybe you prey on the deck that beats the deck, right? Like you have a good matchup into Prism. What are your other matchups like? Your plan A is like pretty strong, but I don't think it's as strong as, say, Briar or Viserai or Star of the Show or Prism, in fact. So I think you can game yourself into maybe playing some of these decks, like you say, and then you might not play those decks. You could go through calling Indie on day 1 and not see a Star of the Show. Like it's not actually, a Prism. It's not out of this world, right? For that to happen if Prism ends up being 20% of the meta. That's not actually that crazy if you don't see one on day 1. So I think it's really important to understand it. That said, though, let's talk about next. What's next? We've got week 4 of ProQuest, and then we're into Indianapolis. Do you see innovation? Like you said, I said I don't expect to see the meta shift much, but do you expect to see some innovations coming? Like are people going to start to at least maybe find some decks that can spike tournaments? Maybe they're bad in Star of the Show, but they target all the other decks that are running around, things like that.
For something like the calling Indianapolis, I think no. I obviously cannot, I can't make a prediction that encompasses like some sort of black swan deck that just comes out of nowhere and is completely innovative and it just beats everything. But I do think that there will not be much deviation from the data right now, right? So the data now in week 3, coming towards the end of ProQuest, which I think that there's plenty of time for it to change, but in this case, and in the case of Flesh and Blood, I don't think it'll change very much. I think it'll be Starvo, Prism. I think Viscerai is going to drop off more. I honestly do. I think Lexi will rise a bit. Other than that, I think that it's going to be very predictable. It's going to look quite similar to what we see right now in ProQuest season. What about you?
Yeah, I do. I think will Viscerai drop off? That's a good question. I think Viscerai might a little bit and might be represented by a couple of the other Runeblades. Like maybe players will change from Runeblade to Runeblade, or maybe they might jump on something that's, maybe they just even up jumping up to Star of the Show. Not sure, but yeah, I could see that happening to a degree.
Yeah, I would say right now, I can even call it. I would say I'm 90%, 95% to play Prism in Indianapolis.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay.
Yep. I mean, what else would I play, right? Like, give me another deck that you think is a better pick, or even potentially a better pick than Prism right now. And we can even extrapolate it to 2 weeks. So there is a bit of an unknown here. The data can change, of course. But I think right now, almost unequivocally, Prism is going to be the best pick for me heading into Indianapolis. Because like I said, I don't expect this to change very much. I expect the meta to remain pretty much the same, but I expect Viscerai to fall off a bit and Lexi to rise a bit.
Yeah, I think
probably, like you said, derivatives of Viscerai as well. People hopping on to other Runeblades.
I think Viscerai is still a good pick. I think Star of the Show is still a good pick. But I know you, like we talked about, there's reasons that probably none of us would play Star of the Show because of, I just think it's hard to win an event with that deck unless you get the right top 8 bracket or, and on the flip side of that, I think, like you say, Prism can do that potentially a lot better. So, yeah, I mean, Viscerai would be the one that I put in the ring, I guess, in terms of what could compete for maybe the deck that, like, if I was going to Indianapolis, I think I would either be playing Prism or Viscerai. I think it'd be the two decks I play, and like an outside chance that I would play Briar, but I think that's a really small outside chance because, like you say, I think that's probably just trying to game the metagame too much, and I don't think Briar has a good enough matchup into Star of the Show, to be honest. I think that matchup is pretty hard, so I think playing that deck is like kind of a no-no for me right now, unfortunately, as much as I think Briar is really good into a lot of the rest of the meta.
Yeah. So with kind of, like I said, 95%, that I think the rest of that 5% is me audibling to either Viscerai or maybe another aggro deck, right? But other than that, I'm pretty much. It looks like I think mentally I'm locked into Prism right now.
I would play Star of the Show, but I would need to have a list that I feel can compete better into Prism, which I'm not sure what it is right now.
To be fair, I don't think that either of us has worked too hard on innovating that list. So, like, I don't think that that's strictly the incorrect deck to play, or it's just a deck that's not on my radar right now because I don't want to be burdened with trying to fix that Prism matchup. I don't think that it's good enough. It's like, okay, if I can get a little bit of more of a margin against Prism, is this still the deck I want to be on? And I think no. Like, I don't think that that's enough for me.
Yep. I think there's a long way to go to have a list that I'd be happy with. Anyway, that's it, Brendan. I want to, something that we never do, but we're going to do it because we're at the end of I guess the first part of the Everfest season. We're going to do a tier list.
Oh, goodness.
Together. We're going to do just a bit of where we think heroes are sitting right now in terms of tiers, and this is based on fully our opinion. This isn't even, we're not even looking at the data necessarily, although we can take the data into account with how we feel. Obviously, there's some really important information there. But also where we feel that these decks play into basically this tier list for me is what we expect to be in Indianapolis. We've just talked about that a bit. We expect the big three to really be represented, but the field to still be somewhat open with probably around 40% of the meta making up other decks. So, let's talk about it. What do you think of the tier 1 decks in this format right now?
Yeah, so tier 1 is 3 decks, right? We have Bravo, Star of the Show, we have Prism, and I think Viscerai as well.
It's the big three. Because the data would say maybe it's just the 2, right? It's just Prism and Star of the Show.
It looks like it, right? I mean, Viscerai is still there. It's still putting up wins. But yeah, I mean, Viscerai, out of those 3, there's only one that in my mind that has a potential to fall out of that tier 1 range. And maybe to like a tier 1.5, not even that far. And that's Viscerai. Prism and Starvo, I don't see it. Cool. They're locked in.
I agree. I think the reason that Viscerai is going to definitely stay there for me while we're doing this exercise is what I talked about before, beyond the data. I think you just aren't seeing just how complicated. I think Viscerai is the hardest of those 3 decks to play and play well. I think Prism is actually harder than people think maybe to play, but is Viscerai is definitely in that camp. So yeah, I would agree. All right, tier 2. So these decks are competitive. They are going to show up in Indianapolis, we think, and probably do well. We might even see a copy of one or two of these in the top 8. Tier 2 decks, Brennan.
Yeah. So I think Lexi is. It can potentially encroach on tier 1.5, but I do think it's a tier 2. It's a tier 2 deck. I think the deck is so strong. What's so good about Lexi is that you sit across from a Lexi, like you have to hedge for two and kind of even three wildly different scenarios. Yeah, wildly different scenarios. So it's tough. I think that gives Lexi a big edge. And then after that, it's just the Runeblade package for me. It's going to be Briar and Chain. Those decks are still very proactive. They're very strong. And just, Runeblade power level is currently at a point where I think that it was guaranteed to be tier 2 and above.
I think, I agree. I think for me, I think Briar is like kind of my dark horse for this format. I think your Starvo matchup is not great, but if someone can fix that and they come up with they show up with a strong Briar list, I think they're going to do well. And I think they could even top 8 or, potentially win the event. Like Briar is, I'm calling now the dark horse for me for this event. I think it's very good. Lexi, I think, is in and around there. My problem with Lexi in this format and why I don't think it's going to get to tier 1 for me anytime soon in terms of where the meta is right now, unless it shifts heavily, is that it's really hard to be good into, I think, honestly, like 2 of the 3. I think you can be good into 1 and then have a decent matchup against another one, but then I think your matchup's going to be quite bad against the third one, just based on how you can look at an ice-based deck, you can look at this like fuseless kind of aggro deck, or you can look like a lightning deck that has more on-hit effects but is damage. I think it's really hard to play into enough of the things that can target 2 decks, so that's the reason Lexi sits there for me. And then Chain, honestly, Chain can fall to tier 3 for me. I just don't think Chain's a very good deck.
I think that our bias, I don't know. It's hard for me to. I think that when I evaluate Chain, when I think about it, I have an opinion. I just have to remember that I'm kind of a Chain boomer these days. The way that we enjoyed playing Chain and why we appreciated Chain's power level is wasn't necessarily just getting a card every now and then and flipping 6, getting 2 off of it, and just kind of seeing where they land. So I think that the playstyle is just wildly different these days, and it's hard for me to give a fair opinion on it. So I just don't.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I think people are going to disagree with me and prove me wrong, and Chain's still going to do well. I just feel like that deck is significantly underpowered compared to other things. I mean, Invert Existence is a very good card, and you have access to Husk, and there's certain things that are going for Chain. But yeah, I just think if I'm going to play an aggressive Runeblade deck right now, it's going to be Briar, or it's going to be an iteration of Viscerai. Anyway, tier 3, these are decks that may be playable, going to sit around the fringes, still win some ProQuests this weekend probably, and have a reasonable time into part of the meta. I think for me, it's probably Katsu is probably rising for me. I think we're starting to see a bit better, more refined lists of Katsu, and a super aggressive deck with on-hit effects is never going to be bad considering the decks that are doing well right now. Prism, star of the show, Viscerai. And then I think it's probably Ultim, Reinhard, Dash, and the OG Bravo.
I'd agree with that. I'm interested to see where Oldhim lands, especially if Prism does start to kind of raise in stock, because I know that matchup is quite tough. And Dash, I haven't seen a lot of it myself, but it does seem like it has potential for sure. Anyway, let's talk about the tier 4. Let's talk about what's going to piss people off.
I mean, it's everything else. Bolton, Azalea, Dorian, Livia, and Kano for me.
Saber Bolton down there? Oh my god. Let's take out our pitchforks, Hayden. What did you just say?
Could be tier 3, actually.
Yeah, people love their Saber Bolton. Gosh, that has to be a rough match. I feel like that has to be a rough matchup in the Starvo, because there can't be a matchup where it's easier to just hold the freaking pulse and then just go back to back and back than this this other deck that's trying to execute an FTK plan, but probably has a bit less consistency and to an extent a bit less speed than Viscerai. So I think it's, I don't know. I haven't played it enough, but I know I've seen a lot of Bolton Saber disciples online. that are saying that that's the dark horse of this format. Hayden, do you agree? I want to get you locked in.
Could be. I actually, you know what? I'll put it in tier 3. I'll raise it up. Bolt and Sabers tier 3. It has a powerful plan A, right? Like you have this powerful game plan, and it might not line up as favorably into the current format as maybe you want it to, but at the end of the day, it can do a powerful thing. I haven't seen people messing around with Oath, the new card from Everfest, as much as I thought, but I did see at a ProQuest in week 1, someone across the table from me like have Oath +2 Lunar Ascension. I was like, oh, that's actually pretty good. So yeah, look, and it top 8'd the ProQuest on Saturday that I played Levier at with a player who plays a lot of Bolt and Sabers and continues to do well with that deck in our local meta and is a very good player. So look, shout outs to Tom. I can see it, spiking something, doing well. It's been winning events, especially in Europe. So yeah.
Yeah, the Europeans love it. All right, Hayden. That's not the end, though.
It's not?
Now,
okay.
No. What do you think of Everfest from a game design perspective, now that you've been able to experience it and kind of, get a little deeper? Get a little deeper in some of your understanding, playing with the cards, things like that. Do you think it's a good set design? Before we were criticizing it for not being on the, sort of the same level as Crucible of War. What do you think now that you've played with the cards? And then I know I asked you a lot of questions already, but finally, do you think that this format is fun? Are you having fun?
Oh, good questions. Okay. What I think of Everfest design. First of all, I do not think it is as good a set as Crucible. I think it's a really hard. I think Crucible might be the best set so far in Flesh and Blood. Like that's a really hard ask to get to Crucible's level, I think. It added so much to the game. It changed the way that so many heroes could play. It introduced us to these majestic equipment which have such strong but I think like quite well balanced effects. It introduced staple commons and rares into the game as well. I think it's really tough ask to be better than Crucible, but I think Everfest is doing its best to be in and around that ballpark. I think the design for the most part is good. I think a couple of classes got left on the cutting room floor, unfortunately. Shout outs to Brute. But yeah, I think overall they've done a pretty good job with the design of Everfest. There's definitely things I think could be better in terms of the way that it might impact the format, but I also think that we're not all the way down the well with this format, right? Like I think there's still things to explore and innovate on, and I'll go back to cards like Earthlaw Bounty. Like we have not seen that card come around, and I think that card is very powerful. I think there's other Majestics and certain cards we haven't seen, have their time in the sun yet. And with Crucible, that was the same, right? With other sets, we've picked on these cards before and be like, this card's powerful, but it just doesn't quite line up at that time, or it doesn't quite work in the meta, or there's just not quite the support package for it yet. But I think that there's still enough of those around there. Rain Razors, like there is these cards around there that I think are good enough to potentially impact the format, and we haven't seen something yet. So yeah, from that regard, I would say pretty good. I'm not disliking it, that's for sure. So I guess enjoyability, like how much am I enjoying the format? Quite a bit, I would say. I think it is quite a fun format, to be honest. I really enjoy playing into Bravo Star of the Show, to be honest. I know people are like, oh, he clearly hasn't been Oak and Old Fuse 3 times in a row enough, things like that. I think there's ways to target this deck. I think there's ways to play into it. It's people call it a casino deck. It's not really. Like, you are pretty likely to hit this hero ability, especially once you get to a point in the game where you can hold a pulse into certain matchups. The job then is to make sure that they can't hold a pulse. The job is to make sure that you put pressure on this or have a game plan around that, go around it. And I think there's multiple decks that can do that. So yeah, I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed playing multiple decks in this format. I think it could be more enjoyable. I think some of these fringe decks could be a bit better. I think it is like Star of the Show is a meta check right now, which is maybe a bit more powerful than I would like, for sure, in terms of a bit more of a check. I would hope that Prism starts to, increase even a bit more, just to make some other decks more viable. These ones that don't have good matchups into Bravo Star of the Show. But yeah, I think there's also, you can look at some of these fringe decks and you can tune and probably get yourself to have somewhat of a close matchup with Star of the Show without impacting your game plan too much, I think, which is quite cool. And I think there's more for us to find and discover. But I mean, I've been going to these ProQuests. I sat on Saturday night and thought, you know what, maybe I won't go to this ProQuest tomorrow. It's 2.5 hours away. 20 minutes later, I was like, no, I'm definitely going. I'm enjoying this format. I want to play more Flesh and Blood right now. I want to play more competitive games of Classic Constructed.
Yeah. How many potions you been putting in your decks?
I knew you were going to bring this up. None so far. I'll tell you what, Talisman of
That's weird.
Warfare. The card is very good.
Yeah. I feel like 30% or so of the set was actually just designed around these potions, and yeah, we'll see. I thought like I was like, okay, Briar power level brought down, Plunder Road banned, so overall aggro archetype probably worse. Maybe we can, we'll start seeing some use out of these potions. Obviously, there's some that are very good, specifically in Blitz and things like that. But and even in Class Constructed, like you said, Talisman of Warfare very popular. There's a lot of others though that are weird, right? The cost of having a potion in your deck, at least in all of the metas that have ever existed in Flesh and Blood, has been extremely high. The 0 block card. So feels like a weird design. I'm with you though in terms of Everfest. Its identity is lacking. Everfest, every card was a story, right? Every card was a story, and yeah, sorry, definitely Crucible. Yeah, every card was a story, and I felt like there's a lot of design and sort of, kind of, I don't know, a lot more. I wouldn't say thought, but like intention behind that set. And I feel like we're even still discovering kind of some of those cards from that era. Everfest was just a bit more flat for me, and I think in its execution as well. So, like, when we actually started playing with the cards, that is ultimately how it played out. But I do think that if your class was one of the big winners, that is quite a good set. I think for Illusionist, the set was incredible, right? This is what Illusionist needed. This went from being one of my least favorite classes in the game from a gameplay perspective to one of my favorite.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think there's a big win with that one, and some other classes got upgrades as well. Like you said, that came at the cost with some being left on the cutting room floor. Nevertheless, Flesh and Blood is an incredible spot, especially for competitive play. We have Calling coming up, then the Pro Tour, the first Pro Tour, which is going to be incredible. I'm just kind of realizing like how daunting that's going to be as we sort of sit here and analyze the meta on a week to week basis. But I'm excited. I think we're in a great spot either way. But yeah, just wanted to get your thoughts on, if you're having fun, because I know the community is very, very active with their opinion on Everfest so far.
Which is fair. I get that. You know what? I completely forgot about the potions. I might have to dock my grade in Everfest so far. But it's one of those things where it's going to be nothing and it's going to be a whatever until it's not. And then it's going to be something. And then...
Which is fair, yeah. That's fine.
Yeah, let's see what happens. But that also, that could be not a positive. But we'll see.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Hayden. Well, good talk. There is no Google review this pod. We haven't gotten any more Google reviews.
Get them in. Get them in. Make Brendan laugh,
Please make me laugh with these Google reviews. I can't even tell you in words. My immeasurable sadness is I go to find a Google review for the podcast and there's nothing there. It is truly a bad feeling. But anyway, I'm excited, Hayden, moving into this next week. I may be going to Oklahoma. I may be staying here. Turns out there is a tournament down here in Dallas. It is not a ProQuest, but it is a 1K Class Constructed, and then a 1K Blitz the next day, which is ridiculous. So might be going to that. But yeah, Hayden, why don't you go ahead and why don't you close it out for us?
Yeah. So just before we wrap it up, we will be back with some more videos on YouTube. For the last couple of weeks, it has been a bit quieter as we've been working with LSS on these Fab TCG Gauntlet videos, which we've again loved to do. But we'll be back with a few videos. We have done a couple of deck techs over the season already. I'm sure we'll be doing more. You can follow us both on Twitter. Come and engage with us. Tweet at us. Join the Twitter community of Flesh and Blood. It's actually, I had some reservations about Twitter. It's actually a great community. I'm loving it. Brendan is at Brendan APG, and I am at Fian_Dale. All Fab related things and some non-Fab related things. Patreon, big thanks to all of our patrons and all that you enable us to continue to do to our Discord community as well with our patrons. Thank you very much for engaging and being a part of that. And it's our AP family that we have. And other than that, Brendan, I'm going to be watching the coverage for Calling Indy in 2 weeks, so if people are hanging around for that, I'm sure we'll be able to set up a bit of a watch party. Come and join along. I can't wait to see Brendan on camera again. I've requested round 1 on camera for Brendan.
No problem.
Let's see what happens.
Can't lose. Never could. Never will. Easy money camera games. Everything else was just... I was trying to weave this narrative of me having bad luck on camera just so that I could pull out the big dub and surprise everybody when it matters.
All right. Well, we'll see what happens. Until next time, we'll see you later.